One of the biggest misses around ADHD is oftentimes it's treated as a motivation disorder. It's not a motivation disorder.
Constant change. No single day is the same. For me, it's what I love about being a founder.
You have a Ferrari for a brain, but it's got bicycle brakes and there's no traffic
Go from idea to action, from idea to outcomes. This has been the most fun part of my journey.
Hey everyone, I'm Matt Hoffman, partner and head of talent at M13. At M13, we invest early in visionary founders, building through structural shifts that create new markets. Those shifts don't just change industries, they also change how people work, how they lead, and how they collaborate. Today's conversation is with Everett Cook, founder and CEO of Row, and ADHD coach Rita Ramakrishnan. Over the years, I've had countless conversations with founders, operators, technical leaders who identify as having ADHD. And what always strikes me is how many highly successful people are navigating similar challenges around focus, prioritization, executive functioning, and energy management. Often they can't talk about them openly. And so the goal of this conversation isn't to present it as either this superpower, and certainly not as a limitation. It's just to have an honest discussion about how different people work, lead, and build, and what happens when you design systems around how people's brains actually operate. We talk about leadership, productivity, decision-making, self-awareness, and the practical strategies that help people perform at a high level over long periods of time. So let's get into it.
Hey everyone, it's Paris Hilton. My husband Carter, who founded M13, asked me to record a little message because he knows how passionate I am about ADHD and neurodivergence. As someone with ADHD, I know firsthand that what makes you different can actually be your greatest superpower. For so much of my life, people saw ADHD as something that would hold me back. But for me, it's been one of my biggest strengths. It's fueled my creativity, my imagination, my ability to think differently, take risks, and build businesses. Honestly, I don't think I would be the entrepreneur I am today without ADHD. It's helped me see opportunities where others might not, dream bigger, and turn ideas into reality. The very things I was once told were challenges became some of my greatest strengths. That's why I'm so excited M13 is hosting this conversation. When we create environments where people can show up as their authentic selves and embrace the way their minds work, incredible things happen. There isn't just one path to success. Different perspectives, different experiences, and different ways of thinking are what drive innovation and change. So let's continue celebrating what makes each of us unique, supporting one another, and recognizing the power in our differences. Because when you own who you are and turn your challenges into strengths, that's hot. I appreciate M13 so much for creating space for conversations like this, and I'm excited to learn from today's discussion. Thank you, Matt, Everett, and Rita for sharing your insights and showing up for our community. And thank you to all for being here today for our M13 founders. Have a wonderful time. Loves it.
Cool. Not AI, actually a real intro. So that's kind of exciting. I think it speaks to the topic. This was definitely one of the events that we've put together. We always try to find unique events, ways to connect with our founder community, ways to connect with our tech community. When we did this was one of the events we've done that's gotten the most feedback. I think it really resonates with a lot of people, especially in startup. Everyone kind of goes through some of this stuff and everyone's feeling it. So it's great to see such a turnout. I'm very appreciative. Let's get right into it. To start, Everett, share a little bit about your background, what Row is, why you founded it. Rita, I'll ask you the same and we'll kind of talk more detail about that.
Cool. Thanks, Matt. Hi, everybody. I'm Everett Cook. I'm CEO and co-founder at Row. Row is a business banking platform. We started in 2019, right down the street here. Today, we support a huge percentage of the startup ecosystem. 8,000 founders use Row every single day to manage their finances, grow their businesses, over $4 billion in assets, and scaling from there. We started Row because I was trying to open a business bank account as a founder, and I recognized that this was a terrible experience. It could be just much better. It can be reimagined in a way that, delivers like a world-class product experience plus the best client service in the world, and really built for that founder to help them run their business and scale it. And so that's what we do every single day. If you're a founder, you're starting a business, please talk to our team. But yeah, happy to be here. And M13 led our Series A in 2020. Have been great partners and investors throughout the journey.
Awesome. And Rita, share a little about your background. Former CHRO, now full-time coach. Talk a little bit about that and what kind of led you to where you're now and some of the research you're doing.
So former CHRO, used to be the chief people officer of Cadre, which was a fintech, Series C. I had an executive coach while I was there. And one of the things that I've realized is executive coaching is extraordinarily beneficial as a leader. It can help you excavate new levels of intelligence, awareness, leadership. But as a neurodivergent person following a very linear arc with coaching, it was just deeply exhausting for me. Prior to Cadre getting acquired, I had become a certified executive coach, largely because I wanted a bigger toolkit to be able to coach and develop the leaders at the organization. But then I started getting really curious about how we might modify the arc, how we might change the way we coach, still honoring the tenets of it, but framing it in such a way as to support neurodivergent leaders, ADHD leaders, and lean into the way they think, lean into their natural brilliance, and help them excavate their own stories, their own wisdom, their own creativity. So I've been doing this now for a little over 4 years. I'm also now a doctoral student. A couple weeks ago, I finished my master's at Penn. So I'm starting my doctorate at Columbia. My core research focus is around neurodivergent leadership and more specifically success factors in the workplace. Success factors in the workplace, how do we create environments in which ADHD founders, leaders can be their best selves, can drive extraordinary value without exhausting themselves? And what are the coaching modalities and methods that we can utilize to help them be successful?
Amazing. Thank you. So now that you're coaching full time, we actually had this conversation earlier, just to kind of level set a little bit. First of all, I guess to start, how prevalent in your experience and to the research as well, how prevalent is ADHD amongst founders, startup executives, from what you've seen? Where would you kind of peg that at in terms of the environment right now?
Yeah, so I would say official numbers from studies peg entrepreneurs as roughly that population, 35% have ADHD. That doesn't necessarily take into consideration other forms of neurodivergence. That's just ADHD. And there's a footnote in that study that says this is highly underreported. So the real numbers, I would say in my experience working within the context of the startup ecosystem, is closer to 40 to 60%. More like 40 to 60%, around 50, 55.
And is there something about the startup, the tech environment that draws people in more, that rewards their brains in a certain way? Is that overrepresented? Is that generally represented? How would you kind of describe that experience?
So when we think about a neurodivergent brain, we're talking about spiky profiles. So there are some strengths and some skills where you are extremely high and extremely low. And everyone has their highs and lows, but a neurotypical person is within one standard deviation, maybe 1.5 standard deviations of what the norm is. A neurodivergent brain, an ADHD brain, will typically spike 2 to 3 standard deviations away from the norm, higher in things like pattern recognition, information processing speed, creativity, decision.
All things that kind of lend to kind of startup environments, right?
Exactly. All things that lend to startup environments, and particularly around entrepreneurship, idea creation, being able to follow something, hyper-focused, going deep down that pathway, and investing the time you need to bring something to life.
And then if you don't mind sharing, given that kind of profile, when did you kind of realize that this actually describes me too?
Yeah.
And what was that journey like for you as well?
So I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was in university, and it was second or third year university. It was an unrelated thing that I'd gone in to see a psychiatrist for, and she was like, okay, but can we talk about your ADHD? So kind of like a bit of a surprise, but we sort of talked through the diagnostic criteria and it had all sort of made sense. And at that time, it was still deeply stigmatized. It was treated as a disability, and for some folks, it is still. But one of the things I realized is all of the areas in which I had been successful, the projects, the work products, anything in which I'd been successful, it was because of the traits of my ADHD that got me there. And so it was sort of in my late 20s, early 30s where I just pivoted the language that I used to describe my neurodivergence and my ADHD. And I prefer to talk about it as strengths or skills and areas where I need a little bit more support.
So Everett, is that similar to your experience as well? Does that resonate?
It definitely resonates. A lot of that, is definitely true how I feel in my daily life as a founder. So I was diagnosed with ADHD or ADD at the time, I guess, in I think third grade or second grade. So a very long time ago, when it was kind of a new-ish thing that parents were figuring out. And for me again, like going through school was I would have classes where I would have A's and I would have classes where I had C's. It was like the only constant was like, am I interested in the subject? If I was interested in the subject, I would do fantastic. And if I was not interested in the subject, I could not force myself to memorize or do stuff like that. And so, that was something that was a challenge in school. But then as I graduated into the workplace, I gravitated towards roles that before I started my company that really where I was able to lean into this. And so I was in finance. I was an analyst and worked in global macro investing. So you're constantly thinking about how is the world changing and how are all these interrelated parts moving and how can I understand what's going to happen next faster than or better or in a different way than everybody else can. And so that was an environment that I actually really thrived in. I love that. And then I started a company. I started Row about 7 years ago, and for me, being a founder, first of all, is what I was always wanted to do when I was a kid. I started businesses, and that was what I imagined I would do when I grew up, and really the constant change, the no single day is the same for me aspect of being a founder. Maybe something that a lot of people don't like. For me, it's what I love about being a founder, and it's it allows me to lean into that that all those positive attributes of ADD.
Yeah, and I think that kind of resonates for a lot of people here in startup. I started my career early on working in big corporate environments, and it was tough for me for a lot of reasons. But then going to a startup where I moved at a much more rapid pace, where every day is different, where you're constantly kind of doing new things and iterating quickly, just felt much more natural to me, and I was much more successful. And I think a lot of people kind of gravitate to startups for those reasons. All the things that made it more difficult for me to be successful in a corporate environment, like I could kind of fake it long enough, I'm not terrible at my job, but made me much more successful in that startup for that reason. And I think kind of what you spoke to as well, what kind of take for me is, I think like a lot of people, I'm obviously a little bit older than you, but I didn't really know a lot about this per se until my own children were kind of diagnosed for that. And going through that process with a child kind of like clicked a lot of things for me. And I think a lot of people, to your point, people are talking about it earlier and earlier, and it becomes much more normal to talk about. And I do think those things kind of resonate more general now. So I'm curious, as you think about kind of like destigmatizing, or it's much more common to talk about this stuff, Rita, what are some things that people get totally wrong about thinking what ADHD is versus kind of what the common mythology is? And what are some things that are actually pretty accurate? Like, help us level set for this room, kind of how we're talking about it today.
Who here in this room has ever been called lazy? Yeah. One of the biggest misses around ADHD is oftentimes it's treated as a motivation disorder. It's not a motivation disorder. It's a mood regulation disorder. And so fundamentally, what we think is happening in the brain right now, what most research indicates, is dysregulation of your dopamine systems. You have a Ferrari for a brain, but it's got bicycle brakes, and there's no traffic cop to help really align and drive where the dopamine goes, where the attention goes, where the focus goes. And it becomes worse when you're emotionally dysregulated. And so a big part of the journey for folks, particularly founders and founder-adjacent folks in the startup ecosystem who are navigating ADHD, is to recognize that in themselves and build systems where they can recognize and address moments of regulation and dysregulation.
So for people working in startups, obviously we kind of know all the reasons why we're all drawn to this type of life, but what are some of the challenges that are even more acute in that type of environment for people whose brains work that way? What are some things that should be How should we pay attention to things? What are some systems, like you mentioned, that you might want to set up to account for that or accommodate that?
The core tenets of ADHD, the core spikes and strengths that come with ADHD, are particularly useful at seed stage and Series A. Proof of concept, you're trying to win market share, you're testing product market fit, all of that stuff is great. It's an adventure. You are playing in multiple arenas at the same time. As dopamine chasers, it's really hitting that spot for you. But the thing that you need to be great at, the things you need to be great at Series A and Series B are a little bit different. So scaling is the biggest challenge. And that scaling phase, as a founder, you need to start putting systems and processes into place. You need to start thinking about standardization, financial optimization, diligence, governance, all of that stuff. And that's the boring stuff that doesn't necessarily immediately give you the dopamine rush that you need. And so I would say that is the biggest challenge, is moving from a creative brain, an ideating brain, to a scaling brain can be the most challenging pivot for a startup founder. Or folks in adjacent roles. I would say core executive function. So on a day-to-day basis, staying aligned with what you've already agreed to can be a little bit of a challenge. I don't know if shiny object syndrome sounds familiar or resonates with anyone, but it's very easy to get distracted by a new creative idea. And you've made commitments to your board, you've made commitments to your employees. So diverting people and resources at any given moment is not necessarily an option. So having to regulate yourself, having to prioritize can be a bit of a challenge as well.
Yeah, you've certainly been from the very early stage founder to a later stage unicorn founder. How have you scaled your processes, your system, and how do you set up your day-to-day as CEO now?
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of that. The part I would probably push back on is actually the part that where it's like it is actually a strength in early stage and not necessarily as much in later stage. For me, my journey as a founder, I completely agree with your point about like scaling systems, and you need the systems, you need the infrastructure, you need the people to make sure that that's able to be successful and you're able to execute on your vision. For me, actually, the very early stage of Row, when we had 5-10 people in a room, it felt very slow to me. You would have an idea, you could only do one thing at a time, and taking that idea to reality took a lot of time. You only had one pipe really, like, that you could kind of push things through. As we scaled, and we're about 270 or so people today, as we scaled, like, our ability to go from idea to action and go from idea to outcomes obviously increased dramatically. And now, like, what I'm able to work on, we have 7 product managers all working on work streams. We have a marketing team of 20 or so, all working on different initiatives. And we're able to really, like, for me, it's great because I can work with one team on one thing. And then, okay, I'll see you in a week, go to the next one, go to the next one, go to the next one. And then those things come to life really quickly. And, that's part of that speed is like what we've really built our whole organization around. Is how do we move really fast? How do we ship product really quickly? Go from customer feedback to product. How do we, create, if we see an opportunity in the market, we see a marketing idea, or, we can respond to that really, really fast. And so for me, it's actually, this has been the most fun part of my journey of the past 7 years. It's been the most rewarding. I completely agree, though. It's because we've been able to build those systems. But actually, like, the very, very beginning, when you don't have anything and it's just ideas, I guess that was fun too. But the early part actually was harder for me.
It's actually interesting the way you frame that, because working with some of the founders, for me and for the team, we actually see a lot of founders early on struggle to just do one thing and focus. And I actually wonder if that discipline is why you're our most successful founder. Because even at the early stage, it's hard to do that. But you've actually, whether it was resource constraint or not, focus that out. So I'm actually curious from your perspective, Rita, what are the other systems or things that people can place to create that discipline that Everett figured out intuitively?
Yeah, so some of the work that I do with founders is actually thinking about organizational design. Or even I work with a lot of CTOs who are neurodivergent. So thinking about the organizational design, what are the aspects of this job that you are exceptional at and need to lean in for in order to drive extraordinary value for yourself and the organization? What keeps you energized? What keeps you motivated? What keeps you moving? Let's talk about the other stuff that may not come as naturally to you. How do we either through org design or through tooling, find avenues to address that. So we might have specific hires that are spiky in other ways that can take over some of these tasks and areas. I know it's a little taboo to talk about AI and automation, but there is something to be said for externalizing elements of executive function using AI. It is an
What would that look like? Give an example of that.
So creating agents that can automate certain types of workflows. So for example, first thing in the morning, I have a scraper that basically takes a look at social media, that takes a look at my meetings and automatically gives me context for each of the meetings that I have to be in for the day. I have AI that I will jump into a hyper-focus hole and I will completely forget to eat. That's a very common thing for me. So AI actually goes into my calendar and pops in meal breaks, or water breaks, or breathing breaks, or tea time breaks. So it's thinking about that. I'm very bad about taking care of myself. I'm very bad about automating things like invoicing. And so being able to externalize some of that stuff towards AI, make sure that my clients are getting the level of service that they need, and I get to focus my attention on the things that I'm best at.
I similarly struggled with that when I was this was pre-AI era. It would be way easier to do this now. But I built a bot to order me lunch every day because I would just forget. And so every day at 11:45, tacos from Chipotle would show up, whether I wanted them or not. And that way I could, I would just not forget lunch. And so, yeah, things like that, I think I agree.
And so as you think about which certainly resonated with me in my role, when you think about kind of building your teams to complement your spikes and your strength, is that more, I'm a technical focused founder, I don't love to go to market stuff, I need to hire a growth lead right away? Is it more around kind of role differentiation, or is it, I'm just good at these particular things, I need a number two or co-founder who can do these skills, agnostic of role and skill set?
Yes. I mean, ultimately, the ADHD community and ADHD brains aren't a monolith. Our brains all work a little bit uniquely and differently. This is why I actually really like some types of psychometric tests and assessment, because it tells us where we're spiky. It helps us drive towards a greater sense of self-awareness. And so we can design around our deficits or areas where we need a little bit more support. So there are technical founders or CTOs that I work with, and they are extraordinary visionaries. You can throw them in front of the computer and they can build out something that no one else would have thought of in a matter of hours. Like incredibly brilliant, but the team management side, the day-to-day coaching of the team, not their sweet spot. So making sure that they are a manager of managers and you're bringing in really high octane talent, that is a good manager layer is going to be really important there, or hiring that person, a chief of staff that can manage some of those things. So those are some of the ways in which I would think about it. GTM can be another area of challenge for a lot of leaders, a lot of neurodivergent leaders. So being able to identify, based on who I am when I'm at my best and who I am when I'm dysregulated. What are the things that show up? How do I lean into those strengths and stay regulated? And what do I need to augment myself in moments where the organization needs to be able to do this work in order to thrive, but it's not my sweet spot.
We talked a little bit earlier that this is not, until recently, something that was talked about as much. Certainly there's been a type of stigma in the past. You've talked about, Rita, that kind of masking or covering it up to seem kind of normal or traditional can be mentally, physically taxing for all the reasons we can imagine. I'm curious, what that shows up like in your clients and what they force to do, and whether some of that stuff is changing through conversations like this or just in the popular culture. And I'd love to get your perspective on kind of how that showed up for you as well.
Yeah. Trying to operate the way everyone else does in a world that operates in a very specific way is deeply exhausting. Your brain actually burns up to 30% more glucose.
Is that related to just having to work in a different way, or is related to the effort required to show up in a different way because it's not authentic to you?
Yes, both of those.
All right, I'm going to stop giving you multiple choice questions.
Yeah.
That's fine.
No. Yes, both of those. Operating in a way that is inconsistent with what comes naturally to you is effort, is a calorie burning activity. I would think about it from that lens and think about the structures that you can start to put into place, or the suggestions or changes we can start to make to workplaces to make some of that masking and that mirroring less necessary.
Well, and then talk about your experience. So we talked about it earlier. Like, I'm not even sure everyone on the board knew it, and you had a really good response for why that was the case.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, it's not something that I discuss openly, not because it's something that I'm embarrassed about or, feel like it shouldn't be discussed openly, just because it's just, for me, it's just, it's been a part of my life, my whole life. And so, I embrace it. I lead into it. It's something that, but it's not what defines me per se. And so, yeah, I wouldn't
even be something that you feel would rise to the level of a disclosure.
No, but if you want to talk about it, I'm happy to talk about it.
I'll also just add, the fact that it is more prevalent and there's more conversation about it is helpful, because the hardest part about it is isolation and loneliness, is trying to figure it out for yourself. And so groups, communities, the ability to engage with others who may or may not have similar presentations to you, but can help ideate with you, can sort of be in the foxhole with you and say, hey, I've had that challenge, or I haven't had that challenge, but have you tried this? Is a very energizing way to process. And so I think the more we destigmatize, the more open we are about the prevalence of ADHD within the technology ecosystem, the better it is going to be for those of us who have to navigate it. Is
it something in your experience or as working with clients and coaching that requires kind of a formal announcement or a disclosure in a way that leads to something else? Or is it more like, hey, this is just who I am, here's how I work, and I've been pretty successful at it, it's just another part of my identity? Does it require like a formal, specific thing? And how do you recommend people kind of talk about it once they've come to that realization?
So I'm very tempted to, but I will not go down a research rabbit hole here. But what I will say is disclosure is a deeply personal decision, and you have to assess your personal risk in your environment before you officially disclose. Not every workspace is safe to disclose. That's really unfortunate. And the way in which that will show up is you might get the accommodations, you might get new ways of working that are not just supportive of you, but of everyone else. But then they talk about it like an accommodation. And it starts to become a part of, well, we did this for this person. And so they start to think about it as either entitlements or gifts they've given you, and it changes the nature of the relationship. So that's actually, the research indicates that that's more damaging, and that's sort of the highest risk of disclosure in most workplaces.
And that people feel like it automatically means that you're asking for accommodations, even when that's not the case. You're just sharing it as part of your identity.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think it's like, I mean, if you ask anybody that works with me, right, they're like, is Everett ADHD, ADD? I'm sure like all of them would say yes, obviously. And so I think it's, it's something that like, again, I think that's a good thing. But yeah, I don't think like, I would never like ask people to work in a different way because of that. I would never like be like, oh, like I need special accommodations. There are no special accommodations. You're a founder, like figure it out. The market is a brutal place, and you gotta make things happen. But I think that, it's, I don't know. It's also something that like, yeah, like people understand like that there are different types of people and they work different ways. And you want an environment that supports that and that, embraces that and, is able to kind of find people's strengths. And I look to my team for that as well.
Yeah. And I'll just say, if you feel comfortable disclosing and making it about that, that's fine. But it's also perfectly acceptable to say, hey, I think I'd be more effective in meetings if I had an agenda ahead of time. Is that something that we can experiment with as a team?
Which doesn't kind of like a best practice regardless, right?
You would think. But it's thinking about these small changes that would help you be your best self in the most natural way possible and suggesting it, because it's like curb cuts, right? A lot of the changes that we make in the workplace to help neurodivergent folks, ADHD folks, actually help everyone. So you don't have to make it about a diagnosis. You can just make it about a way of working and be experimental about it.
We encourage our founders to do a couple of things. We do kind of a version of what you might call like a user manual as a manager, and we encourage managers to share that with their teams about how I work and what I need. And we don't put a necessarily label around it. It's just, this is how to get the best out of me. This is how I like to communicate. I prefer email, Slack, text. I do it at these times. This is what I need ahead of time. So I think that framework can be a little bit more kind of inclusive or non-specific. We also do some things which have been helpful too, that kind of like take some of the specific stigmas tied to this or anything else. We use, you talked about assessments early on. We typically use one called called Acumax. And what's really helpful with that is it actually gives everyone a common framework and a common language for just describing how we work. Matt likes to read things before he goes into meeting. Matt is more prone to thinking and talking out loud. And so that's it doesn't come with any attachment to it in that way. It's just a description, but it gives everyone this common framework of language. And it actually encourages us to kind of have that shared language and also to hire for a diversity of approach on a team, because then you get people that kind of mix it out. And that kind of feels like it's not attached to anything. And that works really well for us and our founders a lot of ways. You talked about also kind of some of the approach things around like an avoidance tax. That one certainly kind of resonated with me about when people are likely to put something off and how that shows up. What are some other tools and systems that you work with founders, technical executives, operating leaders? What are some things that you put in to help them navigate some of the things that by nature you can kind of get away with in your personal life? It's not fun when you have a late fee on your credit card, but actually would be really damaging in a work or startup environment. How do you help name those things and then put processes against it?
So one of the frameworks that I think is really important when working with folks who have ADHD is what I call minimum viable routines. It's a play off of minimum viable product, but it's basically saying in order to function at some level, at a basic level, what are the conditions that need to be met? And there's research around this as well. There's research around the importance, particularly for those with ADHD, to have some form of vigorous exercise at a certain number of times a week. And so we sort of talk about this from the lens of, hey, this is what the research indicates. Is this something that's energizing for you? What are some experiments we can run? But you're basically task batching, task stacking, and setting up minimum viable routines throughout the week that the person can follow that sort of automate or take the cognitive load out of operating, out of just being and existing in a way that's productive as an adult. So MVRs are really helpful. The second thing is understand your patterns. So I would say energy management. One of the things I love to do with executives that I start working with is I get them to keep an energy journal. And that means, I think journaling practices are phenomenal regardless, but take a look at your calendar at the end of the day and see what meetings you were in, see what you accomplished, and think about the things, the meetings, the work products that really energized you and the ones that depleted you. And get curious about why. Get curious about what about this was deeply energizing for me. What is this evoking in me? What am I learning about myself? And then we start to think about how to organize our weeks in ways that we're taking advantage of slumps, that we're task batching or matching based on our energy patterns with certain things. It just helps us be more effective in ways that are natural to us. And there are a number of other things that you can do around externalization of executive function. Some of the things like hiring a chief of staff or hiring an EA, I think is pretty table stakes for ADHD executives who are in the tech space at a certain level. So there are a number of different strategies you can use. Everett, I'm really curious about what your thoughts are.
Yeah. So first of all, completely agree. Getting an EA was a life changer for me, and a million things that I would let slip, do not anymore. I think building your team, and I think making sure that you're creating complements to you, so at Row, again, like my operating team, my COO, my CFO, our CTO too, frankly, is are very, very strong sort of process driven people that allows me to kind of make sure that I can, lean in.
And did you intentionally look for that reason?
Yeah. For sure. I'm able to drive a lot of creativity, a lot of idea velocity, and they need to kind of be able to be executed on. And so obviously I look to other folks to develop ideas too. I'm not the only person that has ideas, some good, some bad, but I also know that I have more than enough to go around. And so the shortage is really an execution capability. I think in terms of like energy, the biggest thing that I've, for me is like, I can do, I don't block time. I know that works well for some people, but for me, it's about like leaning into my energy levels. And, if I'm leaning into like when I'm feeling something, when I'm not feeling it, if I block an hour to do a presentation and I'm just like not in the zone, like it's not going to get done or it's not going to be good. At the same time, I could like do that same presentation in 10 minutes if I'm like, if I'm locked in. And I'm feeling it. And so I give myself a lot of time to do things that are like that. It could be like 2 weeks or something like that. That way I can sort of chip away at points when, I feel like my energy level is high, and I feel like I'm super engaged. And then as opposed to kind of being like, okay, I'm just going to sit down and do this and power through it. And so for me, that's been sort of the best thing, is really being able to, if it's 10 o'clock at night and I feel like, okay, like I'm lasered in and I can really focus on this, just going through it and doing it. And again, so by much better output for myself versus, kind of just forcing myself to do the thing when I don't want to.
And you've given a perfect example, like, of successfully designing an organization around the people you hire, the processes, the rituals, the tools you've built to kind of work in a way that makes sense. And most founders do, by the way, right? Like, that's the benefit of being a founder. You design a system that works for you. For people who are not founders, like, how do they find the right cadence? How do they find the right teams? How do they find the right organization? So much of it seems like fit and kind of complementing those strengths and development areas. What are the other things that people can do to kind of build a system that adapts to them in the same way, whether they're a founder or not?
Listen, the greatest gift you can give yourself and the people around you is to know yourself, understand your spikes, understand where you're weakest, and figure out what works for you. Figure out how you show up when you're dysregulated and what dysregulates you. I think Matt gave a perfect example of creating a user manual, but it's also okay to ask for that. So if you're walking into an organization, walking into a new team, say, hey, I want to be transparent around how I work best, and I'd love to learn the same from you. So know yourself, be curious about yourself, be curious about other people, and be willing to experiment and suggest experiments. I would say ask the right questions within the interview process as well. I think interview processes, the number of times I'm interviewing candidates for folks and they're asking me the most watered down version of a question at the end of it because they're trying to impress me. Like, this is actually your chance. You're interviewing the company as much as they're interviewing you. So ask about ways of working. Ask about how often they meet, when they meet. Ask about, where there's flexibility and where there's not. Think about the things that are important to you for you to be your best version of yourself, and pressure test it. And then also acknowledge that no workspace is going to be perfect when you walk in the door, but you can mold and you can shape it, and you can influence change in most of the places that you walk into.
Awesome. And then last question for each of you before we open it up to the group. In service of creating the world that we would like to see around this topic, what would be the one thing that you'd like people to walk away from and do to help move towards that type of world? What's the one thing people can do differently or change that you'd like to recommend or suggest?
Take a moment, pull out a piece of paper, try to think about a time when you were at work and you were blissful, like you were at your absolute best, and write down what made that so. And just read that for a little bit. Understand it for a little bit, and get curious about where else that might show up.
I would just think about, like, again, leaning into, into who you are, into the way that you work, into, and really just trying to, design your world, design your company, design your life, really to get the most out of that. And, thinking about, like, some of the best founders, the best CEOs, the best companies in the world are led by, people with ADD, neurodivergent people. It's because we see things differently. It's because we see patterns when others don't. It's because we understand that an obstacle is actually an opportunity. And it's because we don't stop, because we have, you have this tremendous energy to hyper-focus and just, power through. We think about risk differently, right? We think about opportunities and upside differently. And so, I think that, yes, I don't want to use the overplayed, it's a superpower, but it is, it is different. I think that I'll give you one other thing, which is the biggest thing that I learned as well was, like, not just like, hey, like I need to know myself, and I feel like at this point I know myself reasonably well. Is that I need to understand that, like, not everybody works like me, and so being like understanding that I'm really good at context shifting. I can do 5 things at once. I can go from one meeting to another. I can switch context every 5, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever. It's fine. Most people hate that. Most most people cannot work that way. And if you do that to them, you will drive them crazy. And so, while what is great for you and a superpower for you, maybe a weakness for others. And so you want to be really cognizant of the way that you show up in the workplace and the way that your interactions, engage with others, so that you're not pulling them into a world where, frankly, you're very comfortable, but they're not. And so that's the balance that I think you need to kind of find as a leader in order to lean into your strengths, but not, kind of create chaos in your organization.